Okay, if people could find their way in and have a seat, it's time to begin. Welcome to this morning's session of the Casselman Historians Fall Meeting. We that were here last evening really enjoyed the presentations by Marcus last evening, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say today as well. I'd like to begin just by reading a few verses from Matthew chapter 5. And he opened his mouth and began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the lowly, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And I believe that it's safe to say that if not at all times and in all ways, the Anabaptists tried to live up to that they saw themselves as being part of that kingdom of heaven and wanting to live in that way and wanting to live that out. And many of them were persecuted for what they believed and the way they lived. And just in thinking about this, my mind went to those verses as I was thinking about the early Anabaptists especially. In picking a song for us to sing this morning, I had actually a request given to me that we sing Faith of Our Fathers again. The person said that was such a blessing to them last evening, and they requested that we would sing Faith of Our Fathers again this morning. And I forgot to tell you about that, Denzel, so I'm sorry about that. If you want to put the words up, that's fine. If you can't, it is in your hymn books, and many of you probably know it by heart. Song number 458 in the hymnal. And pay attention to these words. They're so rich and have such a message for us today. So if you would stand and let's sing song number 458, Faith of Our Fathers. Can't see my A front. Faith of our fathers living still in spite of dungeon fire and sword. Oh, how our hearts beat high with joy whene'er we hear that glorious word. You sang that really well. I appreciate that. For anybody who wasn't here last evening, Marcus Yoder, the man who was presenting these topics to us this weekend, graduated with a BA in History from Ohio State University and an MA in History of Christianity from Yale University. He is living in Ohio. He's the executive director of the Amish and Mennonite Heritage Center and the Ohio Amish Library in Berlin, Ohio. And we look forward to hearing what you have to say. If you come up here, we'll have a word of prayer, and I will turn the time over to you. Father in heaven, thank you for this opportunity to learn a little bit more about our heritage, our history, to be inspired, to be warned, to be challenged. And I pray that you would bless Marcus as he speaks to us this morning, guide his thoughts, give him clarity, help him to speak to us what you've laid on his heart. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you. I appreciate you returning this morning. It's a beautiful morning. Saw the true beauty again driving. We're staying at our friend's vacation home in Confluence, Pennsylvania. It's about 24 miles, but it is beautiful, and you were heading into the most beautiful time of the year. I love the natural world and the beauty of nature and things like that. So it is a joy. That part of it is a real joy to be with you and to be in this area. So last evening we talked about the medieval or late medieval world or the early modern world. And in some of the discussion afterward, I'm just going to return to a few things from last evening. One is several of us were talking about the people in that era. Let's say you were born in 1500, you're 17 years old when Luther nails his 95 Thesis on the church house door at Wittenberg. You're 25 years old when this movement begins. And the average life expectancy in Europe in that time period, the median range at age of death is 32. A lot of that figure is skewed by infant mortality rates. But think about if you would have had any infection that requires penicillin to cure in any form, you may have easily died from that infection. So death is kind of, but you don't realize that you live on the cusp or on the leading edge of change that will turn the Western world into something it never was before. That the Reformation, and I'm not just talking about the religious portion of it. There is a social and a political Reformation that begins as the end of the feudal system, the end of peasantry and serfs. It varies. In Russia, it's the longest lasting, but in other parts of Europe, it lasts into the 1800s in some places. But it begins to flip the world on its head, and the world that people have known for maybe 500 to 800 years is changing. You begin to see states gathered together around common culture and language, and the formation of greater superpowers in Europe. England, France, Germany. Germany does not become a nation until 1848. So but this is the thing that kind of flips Europe on its head. And again, I ask you to consider what that means in the age that we live in, the parallels to the age we live in. I'm not a prophet by any stretch of the imagination, but historians do make. Let me tell you like this. When I was at Ohio State, my professor, my mentor, told me it's hard to find jobs as historians. You should go to a job fair. Well, I had a good job. We owned a business. But I decided to go to the job fair anyway. And so Ohio State put on a job fair, and by far the greatest portion of the people set up for the history majors were the FBI, CIA, and the Defense Department. because they realize that historians make good analysts. I didn't apply. But so in looking at history and looking how the world changes after events like this, think about the digital revolution, the kind of changing of power structures, beginning with the fall of the Soviet Union, the worldwide pandemic, the deep questions that particularly young people are beginning to ask about the nature of religion. Like I said last evening at Behold, the Amish Mennonite Heritage Center, the groups that we find most engaged, so here's what we do at Behold. How many of you visited Behold? It is a large circular painting, 10 feet high, 265 feet long. It is one of 3 active murals like that in the United States. The other one is at Gettysburg, and there is one in Atlanta about Sherman's March to the Sea. This, though, is the only one painted by one person. The others are done by teams of artists. But it begins with Jesus and ends with and the modern, the division of the Hutterites, the Mennonites, and the Amish has a scene there. And so we simply take people around, tell them the story. We don't try to proselytize. It's not we are a community-owned organization, so we work across all the boundaries. But we simply tell the story. And in telling the story of God's grace in the past, it's amazing the questions you get. The questions, though, the good questions are coming from high school and college-age students. My tour guides who have been there, some of them longer than I, some of them 20, 25 years, says they've never had young people ask questions like they are now. So I think there is a reawakening of piety. It may be very misguided in many cases, but there is a reawakening of people saying, what is really the true nature of life? How do I live after I die? How do I live well when I'm living? And those are the same questions that sparked the Reformation. So again, I'm asking you to consider some of those parallels to think into the future well. And also, we had a discussion about Munster. And we are all a little insecure about Munster. We don't want to own these people. And again, I'm not suggesting you're like Munster at all. But it's worth thinking, why did it happen? And how does it replicate itself in our modern world? The minute the Anabaptists begin embracing the power structures of their day, the political power structures of their day, this begins to happen. And there is a warning there for us to not view either in America, in the United States, I shouldn't say America, in the United States, there are other parts to America. In the United States, there's a temptation, a strong temptation, and a strong pull from both the right and the left for us to embrace them as the means to bring about true change in America. And let me tell you that that's not going to work to bring about true moral heart change to Americans. There is only one movement that has ever succeeded in doing that, and that is the people of Jesus Christ following King Jesus as their king. This morning we want to look then at the as the movement spread. So at the end of the Reformation, there are 3 possibilities for Christianity in Europe. There is the Roman Catholic Church. There is the Protestant Church. By the way, the word Protestant comes from, early on they called them Protestants. And so the word Protestant comes from that. And there are 2 forms of Protestantism, and they don't agree. They agree on 14.5 of 15 points. They literally, Lutherans Zwingli meet one time, and they cannot agree on the issue of the nature of the bread and the wine in communion. And so they agree on 14.5 of 15 points, and essentially agree that they don't agree because there's that little bit of difference. And so in the north, Lutheranism is the strongest, and in the Swiss cantons and into France and up the Rhine River, the Reform movement led by Zwingli. Now, Zwingli is a tragic case because he has the support of the Zurich City Council, which means he also needs to support them. So in 1529, the first Battle of the Capelle Wars start. And there's 11 or 12 Swiss cantons or regions to Switzerland, and some of them are Catholic, particularly in the east towards Austria, and the ones in the west are more refined, they're Reformed. And they go to war. And in 1531, at in the Second Battle of Capelle, Zwingli is the army chaplain, but carries a sword and is killed in the battle. There's a very famous statue of Zwingli in front of the Grossmünster down by the Lamott with a sword, long sword, planted into the ground and a Bible in the other hand. And that becomes the legacy of the Reformers. They need the power of the state to keep everybody in check. And so both groups continued to practice infant baptism and a deep connection of the church and state. There is another option, and it is called the Teufel, or baptizers, or rebaptizers, Wiedertäufer, and we today call them the Anabaptists. And they are not bound to locality because of their belief that Jesus is the only sovereign that we need to be loyal to in the world. He is the sovereign that we are ultimately loyal to, the King, King Jesus. His movement spreads across boundaries that were always there. And last night somebody asked me about like the peasants. Did the Anabaptists encourage them to revolt against their lords? And in some cases, early on in the movement particularly, some of them may have helped instigate some of that. But by the early 1530s, the leaders of the movement, the Anabaptist movement, are already telling their people that is not the way of Jesus. Well, early on they do. From Schleitheim on they do. They say the use of the sword is outside the kingdom of Christ. And therefore, there are ways to live free and be a peasant. And you need to respect the authorities. A little later on, one of their prominent leaders says, if you want to break laws of consciousness, where you violate your own conscience. But respect all the other laws you can. And so, in many cases, the lords of the region begin to quietly appreciate the movement because it wasn't the violent peasant movement. It takes some years after Munster for that to happen, but those are the three possibilities. And if you are a Catholic, you are so because the Lord of your region is Catholic. So like I think I told you last evening, yeah, here's religious divisions in Europe during this time period. The blue areas are Catholic. Is that blue? Whatever color that is. Green. These areas would be Catholic. So parts of the Swiss Confederation remain Catholic, right up through here. The Orthodox are in the east. The Lutherans are in the north part of Germany. And then down, there's a pocket of them down along here, and including the Rhine River, Strasbourg, and those places. And Calvinists, that should actually be reformed. This is later, but the Dutch republics and these areas along the Rhine here, this is the area of Munster over here, and then parts of the Swiss Confederation are reformed. We shouldn't call them Calvinists until much later. But I put this up to show that, so Germany, the Germans, this is 400 different nationalities, and before 1648, this area is pocketed with different ones. So one lord might be Catholic, and they fight. There are perpetual wars going on in Europe between the Catholic dukes, the Catholic nobility, and the Protestant nobility. They culminate in the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648, where Europe falls into an absolute all-out war between the Protestant forces and the Catholic forces. And in the Peace of Westphalia, they agree that they'll be whatever the lord of the region is, which is what they were before, but they're more united. But for instance, here in parts of the Palatinate, right along the Rhine River here, land changes hand 80 times over 30 years. And the armies practiced this scorched earth mentality where they didn't carry food along, they took the food from the land. So the war would rage over and the armies would take everything, crops, animals, livestock, anything of any value, and then they'd be pushed back and that army would do the same thing. There are places where entire villages disappear in this time period. It is a dark and bloody time in Europe, and it extends from the north down into this area about right here. The Swiss Confederation was allied a little more, so they were less impacted by that, but it extends into this area over here. Now, by 1540, that's a look ahead a little bit, by 1540 there are three distinct groups of Anabaptists in Europe. There are the Swiss Brethren, which come out of Zurich, and most of our roots today are with that group. So I've chosen to focus a little more on that group. The others are worthy of focus, but it's helpful for us to think about who we are. So the Swiss Brethren, they tend to be, they're often farmers or agricultural related people. It's hard to categorize, but it's also spread into cities, Strasbourg, Zurich, Basel and Bern, but particularly then in the Jura Mountains of Switzerland. And then in the east, there is the group in what is now the Czech Republic, and they have this prominent leader named Jacob Hutter, and they become known as the Hutterites. They are the group that holds everything in common. And then in the north, there are the Dutch Mennonists. Notice that's how they were called early on. Mennonists are in Holland, or in Dutch language, they're called doopsgezinde, the baptism-minded. And so I'm just going to talk about the spread right now a little bit more. Let's think about, so last night we ended with Munster and Dirk Willems and held those two together. And I'd like for us to consider, why was this movement not wiped out? Why could they not wipe out the movement even after Munster? And I think there's at least 5 reasons. But first of all is their vision for a free church. Their vision for a church that is not bound to a political entity. Because of that, they're able to spread across boundaries in ways that no other group could. And so it is also, they don't evangelize at the point of the sword. You know how the Protestants and Catholics evangelize in this time period? They evangelize with the sword. They conquer territory. Think about this. You live in a little, what did we call it last night? Garrett. The Duke of Garrett is the head of Garrett County. He gets conquered by the Duke of Somerset. What did they call you last night, Curtis? The Earl of... Yeah. Earl of Oakland. Yes, the Earl of Oakland. The Earl of Oakland gets conquered by the Duke of Somerset County. And the Duke of Somerset County is Catholic, and the Earl of Oakland is Protestant. And suddenly, if you get conquered, you all turn Catholic. And it's how churches grow in this time period, except for Anabaptism. Anabaptism said they're not bound to that, and so evangelism becomes a strong part of what they do. And it's not these coordinated efforts at passing out tracts or anything like that. It is simply people living in the life of Jesus and extending that life to their neighbors. Preaching and teaching in villages. Narita could give you a lot more information about this, but women spoke very freely about their faith in Jesus. 1/3 of the martyrs in the Martyr's Mirror are women. And they had women in the early modern times were considered chattel, owned by their men. They were not permitted to testify in court because the authorities thought that they were too stupid to testify in court, literally, except for Anabaptist women. Anabaptist women were put on trial, particularly in Austria and that area, the Tyrol area. They were put on trial, and their court records exist today, and the authorities said, with your own mouth you preached your message, with your own mouth you will condemn yourself in court. And so the women's testimony is available today, and we suddenly understand that they had a vital role as they moved into villages. In one account, they say, several women came in preaching and teaching in our village and set it all on its head. And again, I'm not saying anything about roles today. I'm simply saying these are people who have been touched by the dynamic power of Jesus and can't keep their mouths shut. The second thing is they believe that faith is both personal and corporate. In other words, you have a relationship with Jesus, but that relationship with Jesus is not meant to be lived outside of your small community of believers. So it's not the individualism, but it is personal. And that corporate faith means that I have a right to examine your life and you have a right to examine mine. And we hold each other in spaces, accountable in spaces that we see. And what that does is create a sense of community, a strong sense of community and belonging. And people want that sense of community and belonging. The third one, their view of evangelism, which ties in with the vision of the early church, so I'm not going to spend much time in, but they really did believe that the way of Jesus was meant to be shared with all the world, and that you were called to love your enemies into submission to the rule of Christ. To love your enemies into submission to the rule of Christ. It's a powerful statement. They also took opportunity with the newest technology. Wait, the printing press. Yeah, okay. The vigorous literature production. They write these little Flugschriften, the little flying word. Flugschriften in German means flying words. A group of Anabaptists are imprisoned in Passau. Maybe 50 men and women are imprisoned in Passau. And there are two, Michael Betz and Hans Betz and another man are imprisoned. Two primary leaders with about 48 other people are imprisoned in Passau, in the dungeon in Passau along the Danube. Along the Danube. And they actually write these little Flugschriften and smuggle them out of prison. Hans Betz, who is one of my own personal heroes in this movement, has preached so prolifically the authorities have burned holes in both his cheeks so he can't get air into his mouth. And he writes these beautiful songs, or ballads, and they're smuggled out of prison. And the Swiss brethren take those ballads, these pieces of Flugschriften, and put them together in a book. And they sing these ballads. And today, our Amish brothers and sisters sing those same songs. It is the oldest continually used hymnal in the world, the Ausbund. And the core of the Ausbund are Flugschriften, common, not just among Anabaptists, but other places, where people are saying, I'm in prison, but it's going to be okay because Jesus is with me. In one of the songs that they smuggle out, there are 14 verses, and they're written by a different person, each verse, and it all flows together. Think about the discussions in prison as they wrote those songs together and then smuggled them out. So they believe very strongly that you should produce. And then their view of persecution. Sometimes we say, we have this kind of Pollyannish view of persecution. Oh, God gave them special grace or something. You know what? It hurt them just as much as it would hurt us. But they actually believed that the cause of Jesus was to live like Jesus, and Jesus is a suffering Savior. And so if I suffer for Jesus, it doesn't get me more crowns in my or more stars in my crowns or anything like that. It literally is a way that I walk like Jesus did in this world. And so they very willingly suffered for their faith. They very willingly suffered to bring love into the world, the love of Jesus. So the big questions in this time period, like anyone, what must I do to be saved? How does one know the truth? What is the essence of Christian living? And what is the church? These are the big questions that they were wrestling with. And I return to these core ideas because I think these ideas answer those big questions. The essence of Christianity is following Jesus. This is what they believed, and it's what allows it to spread. And the Christian community then is bound to share that love and discipleship in giving and receiving to each other. This means mutual aid, but it also means admonition and correction and care. And then that discipleship, following Jesus, is expressed to the world around us through the love and peace we bring into the world. One of the reasons that they were non-resistant, which that is a term, I don't even like the term, non-resistant. It's a passive term. We don't fight. We actually should fight. We're actually called to fight, but we use different weaponry. These people fought, but they fought with the love of Jesus, not with the sword. Do you understand what I'm saying? They brought love into the world, aggressive, pursuing love. And that is a lot more than just passively not doing something. I wonder what our world would look like if we really believed this. So again, the spread, it spreads to the north. Here is Amsterdam. This is the North Sea. Here's Munster. They get driven out of Munster and they kind of spread out into the countryside. But in Mulhausen, there are these pockets. Some of the Dutch Mennonites end up moving to Prussia. And here is the Czech Republic. So I'm trying to make it move, but can you advance the slideshow for me? Or is that the end? There we go. So one of the results of Munster is there is a young Dutch priest in the Friesland known as Menno Simmons. Menno was an alcoholic, womanizer, by his own words. He bragged once that for the first 2 years of his priesthood, before he became a follower of Jesus, he bragged that for the first 2 years of his priesthood, he never cracked open his Bible once. But the events of Munster troubled Menno. He heard it. I mean, this spreads through all of Europe. Munster does. And he heard it. And when Menno heard about Munster, he said, what do these people have? And he began to study the scriptures to refute Anabaptism. But in that study, he found Jesus. And he found the love of Jesus. And in 1536, 1 year after Munster falls, Menno writes against Jan of Leiden, who is the leader at Munster. But already in that writing, he has left the Catholic Church. He is baptized, and the church is so broken by now. He's rebaptized. The Anabaptist church is broken up and kind of fractured because of Munster. And Menno is the one who is able to bring them together. And this is what Menno brought to the Anabaptist church. He returned us to Jesus. He said, when you read the scriptures, they should be interpreted according to the Spirit, the teaching, the walk, and the example of Christ and the apostles. So in other words, when you read the scriptures, you should read them through the eyes of the Gospels, of Jesus, the walk of Jesus. When you read the Old Testament, you should read it through the eyes of Jesus. So one of the things that happens in Munster that troubles Menno is their ideas about the millennium, the millennial return of Jesus to earth. Jan of Leiden said this, the institution of the Anabaptist Kingdom of Munster will usher in the millennium. And whenever you have that kind of language, you have people in apocalyptic moods. And they'll do strange things in those apocalyptic moods. We are wrestling with that in our Amish community in Holmes County. If you did not hear, about 4 weeks ago, an Amish family spent a weekend at a lake. And the mother, 40-some-year-old mother, had been really wrapped up. We don't know what she read or where she got it, had been really wrapped up into saying Jesus is going to return to set up his kingdom on earth. And we need to prove ourselves that we are worthy. She was also struggling with mental illness. And she convinced her husband, before they left for the lake on Thursday, he called his mother and said, he just feels like Jesus is going to return and the end is imminent. And he just wanted to say, Mom, I love you. And they went to Atwood Lake. This is Menno's writing. True evangelical faith cannot lie sleeping. It'll wake up and get the world around us. And when I think about this, like these are practical things that every person in those Anabaptist churches and every person today can do. We can clothe the naked, feed the hungry, comfort the sorrowful. We can do those things today in very practical ways, and that is what Menno called the church back to. They said, rather than figuring out apocalyptic ways about how to change our culture, do it one person at a time with your neighbor. And return it to its core identity as a church that loves and cares for people. He traveled prolifically. One of the queens of the region became so convinced that he was the one that is binding these groups, these Anabaptists together, that she began to call his followers Menno's Light. Menno's people, and then Mennonists, which is where we get the term Mennonites. So already by 1600 or late 1500s, they're calling, particularly the people in the north, Mennonists. Now, how do you arrive at religious truth? For instance, this Amish family I was talking to, I'll return to them in a minute. But how do you arrive at a religious truth? Catholics in that time period said you need to use the hierarchy from the Pope on down, the traditions that we've had, and then Scripture. But the Scripture is interpreted through the traditions and the hierarchy. The Protestants said you need Scriptures and trained theologians. You need the Luther and the Zwinglings. They'll teach you how to live. Then you live that way. The Anabaptists said, no, it is obedience to the Scripture and the body of Jesus. Now, Anabaptists, when they write about obedience, they don't write about obedience to the Scriptures as much as we often talk about it today. They write about obedience to Jesus. Again, it's back to this idea that you read the Scriptures through the life, the work of Jesus. You read it through those eyes. There is a living relationship, not with the Word of God, but with the Word of God, capital W, the Son of God. And you cannot interpret the Scriptures unless you have a living relationship with the Son of God. They would have argued passionately that you can be as trained a theologian as you want to be. But unless you are a follower of Jesus, you cannot interpret the Scriptures. And the Scriptures are meant to be interpreted by the body. They would have said, what is the name of the church we're in? Maple Glen. They would have said, Maple Glen needs to sit together and decide how to live in their world according to the way of Jesus and the Scriptures. And it's not in an individual in the church, but it's the body of believers. And so they had this really Christocentric movement. Now, I'm moving fast because we have got to get them to the Casselman by noon. But there's also some, by late 1600s, they've moved. Many of them have moved into the Rhine Valley. So what happens after the 30 Years' War in 1648? Where the land has been decimated, especially the Rhine Valley, and the Swiss cantons in Zurich want to get rid of their Anabaptists, so they push them out. These are people, last names are just starting. They're people with last names like Müller, Yoder, Haschenberg, Hirschberger, Lamasht. So there's too many Johns. John is the most common English first name. Johannes is the most common German first name. Jan, J-A-N, is the most common Dutch first name for men. And Hans is the most common Swiss first name for men. They're all derivatives of John. Actually, in Russian, it's Ivan. Looks like Ivan. It's Ivan, which is their version of John. A couple of years ago, a lady called Behold where I work and asked if I know a John Miller. I do. She said, he's a builder. Oh, okay. She said he worked on our house about 25 years ago, and she wants to get a hold of him. He did such a good job, she wants to get a hold of him again. And I laughed. And she was offended. And I said, ma'am, there's probably 60 John Millers. And I was wrong. There was 81. Okay? So, last names come as a result of common first names, a few common first names, and so people begin to differentiate as populations grew. But in the Swiss mountains, these Anabaptists are driven out, and the one logical place they can go is north. And the dukes and lords, the nobility of that region, needs tenant farmers. And so they invite them north to settle in the Rhine Valley on their estates, and they're very good farmers. They've been pushed into the Swiss highlands, and they know how to do two things very well. They know how to burn limestone down to make lime dust, and they know how to haul manure. I'm not trying to be facetious here. Many European farmers thought manure was meant to be burnt. They would burn it. And these people in the Swiss highlands with suboptimal farming conditions learned to put it on their fields. And so they take those farming practices north, and in the land that's been ravaged by the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648, they settle. They're not allowed to own land. They make some concessions. They have to pay a special tax because they won't go to the churches. They won't go to the Catholic or Reformed churches, so they have to pay some special taxes. But they won't build church houses. They make a commitment to not build church houses. So they meet in homes and barns, which limits the size of each gathering. So you go to church with your neighbors who can watch over you during the week. And they also commit to not proselytize. It's in this setting that the church, Anabaptist Church, is 170 years old by now. And it's grown fairly stale, maybe. One of the things that they're wrestling with is communion. They only hold communion once a year. And it was common practice for a mother who was nursing or expecting a child to not go to church because of the danger to her of infection and so on. And so some of the women hadn't partaken of communion for 10 years. And they also did not practice feet washing. And they were getting a little lax about dealing with issues within the church. And a young dynamic preacher moved from Switzerland north and began to preach in these churches in the Palatinate. And as often is the case, he was pretty dynamic. The older bishops didn't appreciate that very well. And this conflict developed between the two groups. And the young bishop, let's call him Jake, said we should meet and talk about this. And they do. But the most senior bishop, a man named Hans Richt, does not show up. So they send a girl to fetch him. And he tells the girl, "Ich habe heute nicht benetten kommen. I have hay down, I'm not coming." And when he comes back, Jake is not pleased with that report and asks the rest of the group, who's on the side of Hans? And 26 men stand up. And he excommunicates them right on the spot. Not a good practice, by the way, for human relationships. The rift never truly heals. Jake's last name is Ammon, and his followers become known as the Ammonish, or Amish. So the Amish develop out of the Anabaptist Mennonite movement right at 1700 in first the Rhine Valley, then in Switzerland. Now, what the issues that Jacob brought, we would embrace today. Communion several times a year, feet washing, or many of us would, and also dealing with movements within a church. So it is a revival movement. It's a revitalization movement within the Anabaptist church. And it grows. They're both strong leaders. There's also an issue with Halbteufel. Halbteufel are people who are very sympathetic, would like to be Anabaptist, but aren't willing to take the final steps of being rebaptized. So they go to state church and the Anabaptist church. They want the best of both worlds. And in that world, that didn't work. And Hans Risch was quite sympathetic to that. And actually had a number of people in his church circles that were not baptized, but wanted to be a part of it. And Ammon said, that is not a good way to create a loyal following of Jesus. And in many respects, we would all agree with Ammon. Now, the way he went about it was not right. But the rift never heals. And today, again, I think we need to ask ourselves the questions. I'm going to return to this tomorrow. Who are the true Anabaptists today? Those must be true Anabaptists, right? Is it a cultural practice or a belief system? Is it relevant for the 21st century? These are my friends. I asked their permission. They're walking to church one Sunday morning, and I have to drive by and take a picture and send it to his cell phone. Or maybe this is a Hutterite colony, the Midwest. This one raises potatoes. They supply all the McDonald's in the western half of the United States with potatoes for their French fries. Who knows what McDonald's puts on them then, but anyway. Or maybe it's this one. Yeah, this must be true Anabaptist there, right? Maybe this is more like the Anabaptists. Does anyone know who this is? Who's the man on his Che Guevara. He's the Venezuelan equivalent of Fidel Castro, and was compatriot of Fidel Castro. Early Anabaptism probably looked more like this to the people around them than it does those pictures of the Amish. They're revolutionary. Now, they're not the same kind of revolutionary. Violent revolutionaries, Castro and the other revolutionaries like that, but they upset the balance of power in the European world. But what we keep coming back to time after time is this. When we are willing to, in the love of Jesus, bring that love into our broken world, we will be revolutionary. And so, as we think about how it moved and spread, we'll pick up from here after the break, and we'll move them into the United States and then the Casselman. But I want you to think about why did the movement spread? I think it spread because of its commitment to following Jesus in both personal and corporate ways, which means that they believe that you cannot live your Christian life isolated from your brothers and sisters. You need them. And because of the fact that at the end of the day, it is the love of Jesus that will change our world. And they believe that. Are we doing a short question and answer now? Kent?
Well, that was packed, and thank you so much. I wonder if you could, you talked about the three different groups you mentioned Catholics, and then the Protestants and the Anabaptists. You mentioned those followers of Zwingli, the followers of Luther. Could you just briefly talk about how Calvin fits into that and Calvinism?
So John Calvin is about a generation later than the others. He is a trained theologian in Geneva, Switzerland, and he essentially takes the work of Zwingli and builds a systematic theology around that, and with very practical ways about how that's worked out in the practical lives of people, down to the fact that when they sin, what they should do with specific kinds of sin. I took a class in my master's work on the life and work of John Calvin. I had to read all the Institutes, which is not, you don't want to read it if you're sleepy. But one of the things I caught is he created this kind of system. And from it comes the Calvinism that we know today with its eternal security. And that idea of eternal security is built on the idea that everyone in the region is Christian. So all of the people in Calvin's region, except Turks and Jews, would eventually get to go to heaven. But there had to be a way to fix how badly they lived on earth. And Calvinism is an attempt to try to answer some of that. True Calvinism, as Calvin mapped it out, does not work well in a free church. It needs the civil authorities around it. That's why Puritan New England is Calvinist. And they have the idea that Quakers are going to ruin it because they'll the freedom of religion. So yeah, he married a widow of a man who had been an Anabaptist. Now he doesn't like the Anabaptists very well. Neither does Luther, by the way, and we know Zwingli didn't, because they're dangerous. That's a good question.
Yeah, thank you. I remember, I really appreciated the section that you did on the different ways of finding truth,
Yes.
The differences in finding truth between Catholics, Protestants, and Anabaptists. That was a revelation to me when I first realized that some years ago, that there's a distinct difference in how you approach finding truth between some of these different groups. And I think I'll try and summarize really quickly. For the Anabaptists, you said obedience to Jesus, Scripture, and interpreted through the body.
Yes.
And I agree with that. Why did we split 90 million ways?
Because we're human. Most of our dividing over the past 500 years has been connected to relational issues rather than theology. Not all of it, but most of it. It's like the 14 and a half points that Zwingli and Luther couldn't connect. Yeah, we operate like that a lot. In the ecology of God's kingdom, he has redeemed that and given us a wide continuum so that we can connect with more people in the world. But Jesus grieves when we fight. When we operate with power structure-based ideas rather than love with the world around us, it doesn't work. And it also does not work when we do it within the body. So what would it, I think we're all learning to love, and that's a big issue. We don't like when people are different than us. And so we tend to build little silos and live in our own little silos. Yeah.
It's so easy to wash feet at communion, and so hard to live that out.
Yeah.
As Jesus said, if I, your Lord and Master, serve you, then what ought you to do? And yeah.
It is.
All right. Thank you.
Yes.
And now I've had my first shot at him, and now I will open it up to you. Who has a question that you would like back here? Wait just a moment, sir. There you go. Thank you.
I wonder if you have a preferred term to substitute for non-resistance.
I've thought about that. It's too. The question is, do I have a preferred term to substitute for non-resistance? I shouldn't be negative if I don't have a positive, right, to go with it. I think aggressive love. Like, I think help me discover a word there. Something about Jesus calls us to love the world, love the people around us, and that's not a passive act. So active love. Active love. I like that term much better than non-resistant. And that means if we believe in an active, aggressive love, we will give our life rather than take life. We will give to the world around us rather than take powers. Does that help? I mean, do you have another term that you like?
Well, I've been struggling with it myself, but I wonder sometimes about the way of the cross.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you have a...
Could you give us a word on Sattler of the Schleitheim Confession?
Yeah.
Can you repeat that?
Just a word on Sattler and the Schleitheim Confession. So the Schleitheim is the first organized written confession of faith. And it is not a complete confession, but it hits the 7 main parts that they differ from the world around them. So I think, if I can remember, there's the ban, bread, communion, the sword, separation. By the way, separation of church and state, how to be separate from the world, does not mean you dress differently, not in their eyes. It means that your loyalties are to a different set of systems. And then the swearing of oaths. When I was a little boy, I thought that meant you couldn't curse. Shouldn't curse anyway, but it means actually it's about allegiances. So a lord, a nobility of the region, could go around periodically, whenever he wanted to, and force all his peasants to swear oaths of allegiance to him. And the Anabaptists said, we cannot swear oaths of allegiance except to Jesus. So I've got 5 of them. Shepherds is another one. The early Anabaptists in Sattler would have written that you should support your pastors so they can do the good work of pastoring. There's one more. After we all sit down and after I relax, I'll think of it and I'll bring it back. But Sattler is, he is also, so that's the first confession. Michael Sattler was a Augustinian prior in the Catholic system. He was second in command of a monastery. He was well on his way to becoming an elite, privileged person in Europe, and begins to read the scriptures, which ends up being fatal for him. Because he concludes he can no longer remain there, leaves, marries a former nun named Margarita, and they together become very prominent leaders. After the Schleitheim Confession of Faith, somebody gave up the group, and Michael is captured, tortured horribly. And he keeps preaching, and they finally cut his tongue out, and then tie him to a ladder with a bag of gunpowder around his neck to make it merciful, and are ready to tip him up over into the fire. And they give him one last opportunity to recant his faith. And if he would have recanted his faith, they would have very mercifully chopped his head off. Instead, he's offering them forgiveness. That's much more powerful than the force they were using on him. So, and by the way, Margarita, the nobility, the noblewoman of the region, came to her jail cell and said, I have the power to release you if you're willing to recant. And she said, how can I but go the way of my husband? And was unwilling to, and she was put in a burlap bag and drowned in the Neckar River. This is stories. And by the way, it hurt them just as much as it would hurt us. Yeah, true, yeah.
If you have the opportunity ever to read the book Pilgrim of Flame by Myron Augsburger, that was a powerful, impactful book.
Yes.
A fictional retelling, I guess I would say, of Michael Sattler's life. Somebody else? Yes, back here.
Yeah.
Just
Menno
one moment.
Simons.
There we go. Thank you.
Did Menno Simons not have a relative or a brother that was in Münster?
He was not in Munster, Peter, his brother. So there was a group of Anabaptists who were moving from the Netherlands towards Munster, and they took shelter in an old cloister. And the bishop's forces found out about them and killed 300 of them there. And Menno's brother Peter was one of those. And that's what Menno had heard about Munster, obviously, everyone had, but that's what really put it over the edge where he began to examine. Yeah, thank you, Curtis. Yeah.
Yes, right over here. Just wait one moment. There we go.
I really appreciate the talk again this morning. One of the things that I'm intrigued with is that only 2 years after the birth of the Anabaptists in 1525, you have the people, Anabaptists, coming together from various countries to meet at Schleitheim and come up with the Schleitheim Confession and come up with 7 basic principles. A number of years ago, I had the opportunity of sitting in on a session at Eastern Mennonite University where they explained to the adult nursing program what Mennonites believe, and they had a PowerPoint presentation, and at the end, I was astounded. I said, you know, what they're saying is brought out as the 7 principles of the Schleitheim Confession 500 years later, and these are these liberal Mennonites who say they believe those same things, and if I go to an old order Amish church, they would say the same thing. They believe in those 7 basic things. Now, my question, did Luther persecute the Anabaptists or say they should be put to death?
Yes, he did. Later in his life, Luther is one of these enigmatic figures that brought so much good, but he's a product of his world. The peasants initially saw him as their liberator. After the peasants' revolt, he wrote against the murdering, thieving hordes of peasants and suggested that if they revolt from their political systems, they should be put to death. And he also suggested that Anabaptism is the greatest danger to Europe, greater than Islam, and you should put them to death, as he did Jews. Now, again, I'm not trying to just be harsh. Everyone did that. This is a European world in this time period is very divided into, you have this fierce loyalty to your establishment. And it creates these silos where the only groups of people that are speaking across those boundaries are the Anabaptists. Schleitheim is a good example where people from Germany, Switzerland, all these little principalities gathered together and said, we have something bigger.
All right. We need to cut that off. I'm sorry if you didn't get a chance to ask your question. Maybe there'll be time at the end of the next session, or you can discuss it with him over lunch or something like that, but we need to move on. There is, if you're looking at your brochure, there is a duplication, I think, of the offering to be lifted now and then again after the second session. And I'd rather wait till the end of the second session to take that. We're going to take a break now. Give you 8 minutes, go to the bathroom, get a drink, stretch, whatever, and then try and get back in here as promptly as you can so we can start the next session. Thank you so much.
Very enjoyable. Thank you.
The sessions are being recorded on audio. They'll be available, or they are available on CD back at the table for $3 per session, $12 for the set. They are also available as videos online, but if you would like to have them available to you in a portable format, or you don't have access to be able to watch the sessions online, they are available on CD, $3 per session, back at the table. And even these sessions today will be available shortly after the sessions, and certainly will be available after lunch. There will be a meal served after this session in the basement on a donation on a donation basis. And with that, I will turn the time back over to Marcus for they're moving from you left. We're still in Europe, and we got to get all the way over here.
Yep.
All right.
Thank you. And thank you for your kindness for the weekend. I want to encourage you to engage with the Casselman Historical, what do you call it? The Casselman Historical Historians. Buy a membership there if you don't. Have one and engage. It will take all ages to build into the future. And history is exciting. It's made up of people and their stories. So I would like to think about a story today. And if we can get the screen up, we will. I've chosen to actually call this session Hopeful Journeys. And Delvin will get us up. But stop and think of where we are. Let's say 1700 in Europe. In 1700s in Europe, there are two in the Palatinate and in Switzerland. There's two pieces to the Anabaptist world. There are those who are more conservative, a little more. That's not fair. They're Amish. They are more conservative. See, Jacob Ammon is a tailor. And one of the temptations for people in that era was to break the sumptuary laws. Remember last night I talked about sumptuary laws, about what you should dress like? And he said that you should, if you want to break laws that violate Christ, following Jesus. And if you can keep the sumptuary laws, keep them. So they tended to dress more like peasants, and kept that mode of dress, and if it works, it works, and so they just kept it. Also, this is the Napoleonic, we're coming up onto the formation of nations and so on, and soldiers begin to wear very fancy, decorative, large, expensive buttons on their uniforms. And that was a sign of a soldier. It's also, by the late 1700s, soldiers, the going thing was to wear a large mustache, fancy mustache. And so a man, an explorer, worked his way up into the Jura Mountains of Switzerland and found a group of Anabaptists living way back in, and he said they all had beards below their mouth. No mustache. And the reason they gave is that military men wear mustaches and large ornate buttons. It's legitimate. Don't kind of negative it. It's legitimate. And so that's one group. The other group are known as Mennonites or Taifel or Swiss Brethren, and they are more the Hans Riesch group and so on. And the first Mennonites moved to America in the 1690s already and settled in Germantown, Pennsylvania. The Rittenhouse family is one of the first families here. They didn't have a bishop when they first moved to America, so they wrote back to Europe and asked him if they could send help to help them ordain a bishop. And they said, if you can do it peacefully among yourselves, go ahead and do it. Took a year for that correspondence to go back and forth. And so William Rittenhouse was the first ordained bishop, Jacob Rittenhouse, sorry. His great-grandson became Thomas Jefferson's
chief astronomer. Rittenhouse family had a paper mill in just northern part of Philadelphia, and the first paper mill in the colonies. Scott Paper Company bought them out many years later, and they were instrumental in the development of toilet paper. I read a New York Times article about how Mennonites were instrumental in the development of toilet paper. I love finding those kinds of things in the stories. But the people that settled the Casselman and Brothers Valley and later Holmes County are not those same Mennonites. Most of them are Amish. And so if you have last names that are traditional to this community, then at some point they were Amish. And think about what migration and immigration means. All of us are drawn to our home place. This is a very famous line from Little Gidding, from the Four Quartets of T.S. Eliot. We shall not cease from exploration, and at the end of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. So all of us are drawn in some ways. The fact that you're here this weekend reflects the fact that you're drawn some way to the old home place. The place where your family is from, where you have connections to. And both spiritually and physically, this is true. This happens to actually be the first watercolor painting I ever did. It is of my grandparents' home farm in the Fairview Valley of Holmes County, Ohio. It is a place I have deep connections to. I was born on this farm, in a room in this farmhouse, when my mom didn't make it to the doctor. And we lived in a house trailer that sat right on this side of the fence here. And then 3 years later, moved to the other end of the farm in a house until I was 11 years old. This has deep connections. As a teenager, I worked for my grandfather on the farm, Amish farmer, and I spent many hours on this farm, deep connections. When I painted this painting, I didn't realize that my father was going to die in a very short time. And I just finished the painting, and my mother called. My father had pneumonia. And she said, Marcus, if you want to see Dad alive, you better come home right now. We were living in New Haven, Connecticut. And in an hour and a half, we packed everything we needed. We were in our last week. We had just graduated the week before. And drove 9 hours, 10 hours through New York City. I love driving in New York City. My measure of how good my driving is how often my wife goes like that. So we drove down, and by evening, we're at the hospital in Canton, Ohio. My father ended up living another week and a half. But before we left, I had put this paper, this drawing, painting, into my briefcase. I don't even know why. And the second day there, I found it in my briefcase, and I took it in and showed it to my dad. He was on a ventilator, and he kept reaching out his hands. And so we hung it on the post there. When they took the ventilator off, he lived a little bit of time after that, but he could talk. And he kept saying, "Ich will nicht heimgehen." I just want to go home. I said, "Dad, you want to go to the farm?" "No, I want to go home." But the farm helped him think about the end of his exploring, as it does all of us. All of us have this yearning for home. So the world of Europe. So the Anabaptists, many of them that make up our world today, live in the region that I've entitled the Palatinate. That border there, this is the modern French border here. This is the Rhine River. And they live in this region right down in here. And they have last names like Mueller, Hirschberger, those names in German form. And in the 1700s, they've lived in this area now for about between 50 and 70 years. In 1730s, some of the 1720s, some of the people in the region, some of the non-Anabaptist people became quite restive because they felt the Anabaptists had special privileges they didn't. They didn't have to go to church. They didn't have to pay the heavy tithes in church. Now they had to pay an additional tax. Plus they were really good farmers. And so the lords and the dukes liked them on their farms, but they'd get pressure from the neighbors, and then they'd push them off their farms. They weren't permitted to own land because they were Anabaptist. And they had something called partible and impartible inheritance. So you had a farm, you might have farmed for 2 or 3 generations. And the lord of the region said, you may no longer break this down into pieces to give to your sons and your daughters and your descendants, but you have to keep it as a whole, and only one of them can live there. What do the others do? It's the age-old question. They needed land, and they needed space, they needed freedom. And it's about the same time that William Penn sends land agents to find farmers, and they go up and down the Rhine River, and they see these good German farmers and think, these would be good farmers in this strange place across the Atlantic called Pennsylvania. And they convince some of them to leave. Now they have to pay an exit tax to leave. It's not permitted to just leave. They have to pay an exit tax. So many of them sneak out. And they live in this region. What would it be like if one day your dad came in, you're a little child, your dad comes in and says, kill him. America gehe. We're going to America. Wonder what, have you ever thought about what that was like? The actual feelings of thinking about that. And so one of my first projects at Yale, in 2013 I did the first major project, which ended up being my master's thesis. And I was in a class, and in a history class, and the professor said, pick a person from your world that you want to write about, or that your field of study, and I want you to find a person. It's a immigration class. Find a person that moved for whatever reason, and think about their life and write about that. He said it can be written in a kind of story form. He was also the professor who told me, never write books, never write academic books. Said they almost kill you when they fall on you out of your boredom when you read them. He said you should write books that connect with people. And he said you should use stories. It was the first time I had that freedom in a history class. And so there are very few records of people that we know about who were born, but I did find a few, and one of them was a little Amish girl named Magdalena Lehman. And she was born in the Palatinate to a family. Her dad's name was Benedict Lehman, and they lived in a little village. And think about this little village. Village life in that world was tight. I visited in that region. I've visited several times. There's a Mennonite village there called Deitchhoff. And Otto Showalter lives there. And they've lived in the same house for generations, since they moved up from Switzerland in the 1600s. Now, today they own the land, but that only came about later. And Otto has this big genealogical chart that takes you way back, and he's a fascinating person to talk to. Interestingly enough, when I was there, there's a small Mennonite church there. They said, would you be willing to preach for us? And I said, well, my High German's not that good. I can read it, but I won't be able to. They said, just preach in Pennsylvania Dutch. We understand you perfectly. And so I get up Sunday morning, and I read the scripture, and everything's fine in German, and I start preaching in Pennsylvania Dutch. And a few sentences in, they all start smiling, and they start chuckling a little bit. And I finally stop, and a small group of people, and I say, what did I say wrong? And they said, oh, you're not saying anything wrong. We understand perfectly what you're saying. We're just not used to hearing somebody preaching. They're trying to figure out how to tell me. They said, we're not used to hearing someone preaching hillbilly Deutsch. He says, it's what the old people and the people up in the mountains speak. It's our Pennsylvania Dutch. So we speak hillbilly Deutsch. Also, you might find this interesting. After church on Sunday, we were invited to Otto's house, my wife and I, for lunch. And we came in and walked into the dining room, And I looked at my wife and had this big grin, smile on my face. And I gave her the elbow, and she said, "Stop." Because we had, they put bread on the table and cheese and cold cuts and pickled beets and all kinds of spreads. Does anyone else know who eats that for Sunday lunch? Yeah, the Amish do. You know, my historian mind's thinking, and I asked Otto, "Do you eat this every Sunday lunch?" Otto's in his late 60s at the time. He said, "Huh, we eat this every day for lunch. It's called a farmer's lunch. It's easy to put on the table, quick cleanup." And so the cultural practice that we have, language, food we eat, we brought with us. So that's a village Magdalena would have grown up. She grew up next to her grandparents in the same village. And think about what that would have been like when late in the year in 1736, her dad Benny comes in and says, "Children, we're thinking about moving to America." "Dad, where's America?" "Well, it's across the ocean." "How are we going to get there?" You know, children's questions. By the way, humans don't change that much over the years. So if I put speech to them, it's just because it's what we're used to and they're human. And now Magdalena would have been excited. Oh, this is a grand adventure. But she notices every time she talks about it, Grandma gets really quiet. And as they get closer to the spring of 1537, when they're going to 1737, why do I keep doing it? She notices that Grandma sometimes just kind of retreats. And she realizes that Grandma and Grandpa aren't going with them. And so as the family prepares to leave, she thinks, "Oh my, it's so exciting, but yet so traumatic." And when we think about that, we should be thinking about both the human emotion that goes with that. I'm good at breaking electronics, so anyway, they're from this region. There's battery there. I just don't know how to. There we go. This is the Platnet. This is a view out across the area where Magdalena would have lived from the Königsberg Castle out across. The villages would have had these narrow streets with steps, but they farmed this land. And in the Swiss Highlands, they'd build houses like this. This is an Anabaptist home near Trub, where the Schwarzentrubers and the Troyers and the people like that are from. The right side of the left side of the house, your left there, the brick portion is the living quarters. This is the barn. And it's efficient because you don't have to go outside in the cold to feed your animals, and their heat helps heat your house. Their smell also pervades your house, but be that as it may, you keep the stable clean, that helps. They farm these hills, they're steep hills, but they become good farmers here. And so they're leaving everything familiar and moving into a new world. And why are they leaving? We need to ask that question before we even think about the journey. And they're leaving because, number one, because William Penn's land agents tells them, if you move to Pennsylvania, you can own your own farm. Own my own farm, my own land. They had never, for 200 years, they've not been permitted to own land. Oh, what does this mean? What does this mean for the future? And you'll have the freedom to worship as you wish. And again, there is still persecution going on, although not capital persecution, but there are still Anabaptists being captured. Some of the men are being sold to the Italian Navy to be galley slaves, and women are being sold into household slavery. So families are still being separated in portions of Europe because they're Anabaptist. And so there's also the freedom offered. And I don't want to minimize the freedom from persecution. But for many of these common people who are farmers, who live on the land and by the land that is being offered is as equal a pole as freedom from persecution. And we shouldn't minimize that or make it less spiritual. It's about providing for your family and your future and being able to worship as you wish. So when they were getting ready to leave, they left with a group of 10 other Amish families in the summer of, early spring of 1737. They would have left from the south here, and they boarded rafts. But before they boarded the rafts, let's just go back to the village and think about what this might have felt like for the people in that village as a portion of their community, a portion of their world, a portion of their family is going to leave. Think about what this meant for Magdalena's grandparents. Germans had a particular practice of this region of when they felt sad to sing. And there are accounts of villages where portions of the villages were preparing to leave for America to immigrate, to move to America, where they started singing at 7 a.m. It was 2 p.m. till they finally tore themselves apart. It's like a funeral. And Magdalena would have never forgotten, as a 7-year-old girl, what that was like to leave her grandparents, never to see them again. There's this wild adventure and this deep trauma. But they finally get left. They spend the next 40 days on a river raft. Oh, by the way, what do they take? Magdalena is one of 4 children, so her mother and father are a young family, and it is overwhelmingly young families who leave. It's the young families who leave because they need a hope for the future. There is no future there for them on the land or freedom. And so they would have packed everything in something that Benedict and his wife could carry. What do you take? I often ask children, grade school children, I have a little trunk I take, and say, what, you're going to live the rest of your life, what would you put in this trunk? And the first thing they often say is clothes. The girls say shoes. I say, well, most people in that period had 2 sets of clothes at the most. And so you just wore them to save space. We know, for instance, that they took seeds. They took cuttings from their grapevines. They took apple seeds. They took a few family heirlooms, maybe a dress, a wedding dress, maybe a Bible that belonged to their family. Along with the Casselman, we have some at Beholt in the High Amish Library that came across the Atlantic Ocean in that manner, in trunks of families, or an Osbund. But they load it, and they're stopped 39 times on the trip north to pay tax or toll. It's about as bad as driving on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And again, think about this. They're on river rafts. They're afraid people are going to steal their possessions, so Benedict and his wife have to stay with the trunk that they're carrying for the rest of their life. That's their precious possessions. They have to stay with it. They've got to watch the children. Mom, I wonder how often that she said, but don't get too close to the edge. That's just what moms do, you know. And children see how close they can get. But they would have floated north, and as they floated north, they would have seen the cathedral spire at the great Cathedral of Cologne, Germany, the one where I showed you a picture of last night. And it would not have evoked a feeling of majesty and wonder in Benedict and his family. It would have evoked a sense of fear. These are the places where their families have and their ancestors have been locked into for in the past. The Schlosses. In High German, a dungeon or a prison is called a Schloss, or a locked up place. And they would have seen those places as places of fear. Oh, we got to be careful. So, and these are scenes along the Rhine as they would have floated north. These are vineyards. They have an interesting way of harvesting the grapes. They take pipes now, but they would have taken half tree trunks and put them here down these steep portions and just put the grapes at the top and let them roll down to the bottom into large vats. They're wine grapes, so you don't care about preserving the grape body of the grape. So these are vineyards they would have seen. These are old castles. This is a picture I took in 2017. But there's all these old remnants. These are former Schlosses, where their people would have been locked up into, and they would have evoked fear. Here's just other castles. This is a great cathedral at Cologne. They floated down this river. And when we look at when we do sightseeing on this, we think, wow, what a trip. You know, this is a trip where they're leaving everything they ever had and moving into an unknown future. as they get close to Amsterdam or to Rotterdam, where they're going to board the big ship, Magdalena would have said, "Dad, what do I smell?" And he would have said, "That's a city you smell. European cities stunk. People, there was no sewage systems, so you just simply dump your sewage in the streets. Diseases are rampant. And this is a harbor city, so it smells like sewage and dead fish and tar." When people from the country write about their experiences in the cities in this time period in Europe, they always, when they talk about their sensory experience, they almost always talk about the sense of smell. And Magdalena was no different. They said, "What did oh, Dad, that stinks. Manure smells sweet compared to that." And they would have gotten closer and said, "Where's the big ship?" And they would have seen all these ships out in the distance. Said, "Dad, which one's ours?" I don't know that Magdalena said this, but she's a 7-year-old girl. And she's real. She's human. She has emotions. She would have had fears. And we need to actually, when we think about history, we need to think about those pieces of history rather than all the dates and names. Dates and names are good, but sometimes they get a little boring. It's the human story that's there that's the most important piece. And as they get closer, she thinks about boarding the ship. There's 11 Amish families traveling together. The name of the ship is Charming Nancy. And there's not much charming about it, but she realizes that they're not going to be the only people on the ship. It won't be this exclusive group of Amish on this ship. There's a total of about 400 people in all on the ship. The ship has bunks for 180 people. The bunks are 18 inches wide, 5 feet long, and 18 inches of space between the bunks. So in some places in the hold, they're 6 or 7 high. It isn't made for people with, if you don't fit the 18-inch square space, you're in trouble. So we kind of Laura Ingalls Wilder these journeys. These kind of grand and glorious exploration journeys. Each family had to take their own food. And so they would have gathered biscuits. They would have taken Swiss cheese. By the way, never refrigerate your Swiss cheese. It's meant to be eaten warm. And if there's mold on it, you simply cut the mold off. So they would have taken things like Swiss cheese and biscuits and maybe some salted pork, but very little. And the ship's captain was supposed to supply the water, but he took limited amounts because he was paid for every soul he brought to Philadelphia. So he packed his ships. So in a ship that has room for 180 bunks in the hold, there's 400 people on the ship. And they would have gotten on the ship, the next grand adventure. And we know a lot about this because a number of years ago, Dwayne Kaufman found a little diary in an old family Bible written by one of the members of this expedition. His name is Hans Jacob Kaufman. And he's an Amish bishop who is moving with his family, a young Amish bishop who is moving with his family and Magdalena's family and the Millers and the Masts on this journey, among others, who are coming to America. And he keeps a record. And so he tells us when they sailed. And it's a 2-master, and they would have been pulled out of the harbor at Rotterdam into the English Channel. And Kaufman records something very poignant. The second morning out, Magdalena would have come out onto the deck of the ship. And she would have looked over and she would have seen a small group of Amish families, parents, at the rail of the ship. And she would have thought, well, little children do this, wonder what they're doing. She would have gotten closer. And why are they? There's an Amish couple kneeling there. And she suddenly realizes, with some horror, that they're sewing the body of their child, one of her playmates, into a piece of canvas, putting a large stone into that piece of canvas. And then Hans Jacob Kaufman would have pulled a New Testament or maybe an Ausbund out of his pocket, and he would have said words very similar to this. Gute Nacht, meine Leben. Gute Nacht, meine Herzenfreund. which means good night, those who I leave behind, good night to my true-hearted friends. It is the same hymn that the Amish use at the graveside today. And then that young Amish couple would have picked up the body of their child and dropped it over the edge of the rail, and the hungry mouth of the ocean would have swallowed their child. In all, in the Atlantic journey, from the time they left Rotterdam until the time they got to Philadelphia, Hans Jacob Kaufmann officiated 26 funerals. 24 of them were for children. The average life expectancy of a child, 7 years old and younger, to survive the Atlantic journey, not just Amish, but overall, during this time period, is only 50% of them survive the Atlantic journey. Babies, 1 year old and younger, only 10% survive the journey. And yet it is overwhelmingly young families with children who make the decision to move across the Atlantic to come to the Americas. They landed in Cowes, England. Every ship coming to America, to the English colonies, had to stop on English soil. So they stopped in Cowes, England, where they spent 9 days in port. We don't know, but we don't think the layman's probably left the ship because they would have had to take their trunk with them because they're afraid of theft. And they finally get set sail, and they sail. They spend the next, these are ship holds of this time period. We have this kind of glorified, we have no sense at all of what the ship's journey to America was like during this time period. Good ship captains would lay those ships, with a good wind, would lay those ships nearly on their sides. Think about what happens in the hold of the ship when this is happening. And they got into storms, but the worst thing that happened is when the wind stopped. Because then the ship stopped moving, and it got hot, and people started dying. And water began to run low. It began to ration water. It is a terrifically horrific experience. It is one that colored every immigrant who came to America in that time period, is the journey to the Americas. They left Rotterdam, actually, that should say June 29th because it's hard to go backwards. You don't land in Plymouth or Cowes, England on July 8th when you sail on the 29th of July. I need to fix that. So they left on June 29th, landed in Cowes, England on June 8th. They left England the 13th. Now, there's a discrepancy. That's not 9 days. He says 9 days, but the ship's journey says so. We're not sure. But it went until October 18th till they landed in Philadelphia. From July 13th to October 18th. The average time it took to sail from England to the American colonies in that time period is 6 weeks. This one took much longer. And it is something that shaped those Amish people mightily. Now, after a number, by the way, he also records that they saw one other ship in their entire journey to America. How do you know the captain's going the right way? But it's so colored by the amount of death. Also, though, the amount of hope. You can imagine these men sitting together and saying, when we get there, how will this be? How are we going to handle ourselves? And the sailors are English. It's an English ship, so they don't talk English, and they talk German among themselves. And they get closer and closer, and after many, many weeks at sea, suddenly they'd hear a sailor say, "Land ho!" And Magdalena would say, "What was that? What did he say?" "Oh." And they would have seen this bank out in the west. And they would have thought, "Is that clouds?" It got closer, and the bank did move, and it got bigger and bigger. And suddenly, they're in the middle of the Delaware Bay. And they sail up the Delaware Bay into the Delaware River and 90 miles north to Philadelphia. This bustling city of several thousand people. As they're floating north, Magdalena would have said, those are big woods. In Europe, where she grew from, the woods are tame. There are small pockets of woods. It looked much like Holmes County or Lancaster County in Europe, and they would have, those are big woods. What's in those woods? I'm guessing, he said bears, wolves. That's what dads do, you know, scared. Maybe he said Indians. We don't know. But they land in Philadelphia. We don't know if someone met them there or what happened. But this is a sketch. It's the most thriving harbor during this time period. And all of our people, except very, very few who came through New York, came through Philadelphia. This is a scene in 1750, a few years after Magdalena and her family would have come. And they settled there. Now from there, they're in America at last. Think about what that was like a few weeks later or later that fall when they settle in Berks County. And Benedict takes his family out and says, children, this is our land. Oh, it's our farm. We can own this place. You know, we have a deep commitment to land ownership. I live in a condo. And the number one question people ask me is, how can you live without owning your own land? I say, I own my own land, right from the foundations down, halfway down the world, earth is mine. Okay? But we are deeply committed to land ownership. And one of the reasons we're so deeply committed as Anabaptist people to land ownership is because for several hundred years we couldn't. We weren't allowed to. When we come to America, we sink roots in deeply to the land. And that's where Magdalena grew up. We don't know exactly what all happened, but when she was about 18 or so, she went to an apple schnitzing one night, and she looked up into the eyes of a young man named John Miller, and they got married. Who knows? She fell in love. I guess, I hope so. You know, it's hard for us to kind of put ourselves there, but she did. They're humans. Maybe he did like Joseph Yoder said, he came and threw corn against the window late one Saturday night, and then who knows? They got married. And John and Magdalena, he had been on the same ship. John and Magdalena moved to the kind of the edge of the Amish community in Berks County, and at their own piece of ground, and begin to farm. And they live very near another Amish family who is half a generation older than them, who already has some married children. And Magdalena and John proceed to have children. And in 1757, when we know more about their story again, Magdalena is a 27-year-old Amish housewife who has just had a baby that summer. And her world is about to change in a dramatic way. Early on the morning of September 21st, or 20th, 1757, now they'd heard about a war going on. It's called the 7 Years' War. In America, we have come to know it as the French and Indian War. It's being fought between the British and the French. And both sides are pulling on the Native American populations around them. And, but John and Magdalena lived pretty far away from any of the action. And the community, the Amish community, had gathered the night before at an apple schnitzing at their neighbor's house. A lady she would have probably canned with or preserved things with or cooked with or baked with and gone to church with. And didn't pay much attention to the world around them. The next morning, John went out to chop wood. And as he is chopping wood that morning, Magdalena hears a shot ring out. And she probably thinks, I don't know what she thought. She thought maybe John took the rifle and shot a deer. But a few minutes later, the door of her house flew open and John comes running in. And he's lost his hat. He looks terrible. But the worst thing is he's all bloody. And he holds up his wounded hand. He says one word. Again, I'm not trying to be racist with this at all, but he says Indians. Now, do I know that's exactly what happened? No. But let's put some imagination into these stories. And what happened is a French raiding party moved south to attack the British. It is led by a French militia leader. At least one, maybe two French militia leaders and a small group of Native Americans who are allied with the French. And during the night, late in the evening, early in the night, they come upon the house of Magdalene and John's neighbors. And the dog barks, and one of the young sons opens the cabin door and is promptly shot in the leg. And the boys grab their rifles. They have two teenage boys and maybe an 11-year-old boy at home. They have hunting rifles, and Jacob tells his sons they're not going to fight back. Do we know that happened for sure? No, but they did not fight back. And they went into the cellar of the house. The militia fired their cabin, and they kept the fire at bay with cider in the basement. And the next morning, when they thought the French militia had left, they crawled out of the cellar window. And the missus of the house, we don't even know her first name, was plump and got stuck in the cellar window. In the commotion of pulling her out of the cellar window, one of the young Native Americans who was with the group had come back to their peach tree, heard the commotion, and brought the other militia back. And they killed Mrs. Hostetler and their daughter and the son who had been wounded, and took the father and two sons captive. And as they're leaving the community, they go past John and Magdalena's farm, and it's daybreak, and they need to get back into the Blue Mountains. And one of the Native Americans takes one shot and hits John in the hand, and his hand was on his axe handle, and the axe handle deflected the bullet. We don't know what Magdalena did that morning. The natural thing would have been to run to the neighbors. Maybe she did, but we do know the Amish community gathered later that day. And a new young bishop named Jacob Mast would have said those words, Gute Nacht, der meine Leben, Gute Nacht, der meine Herzenfreund, over the grave of the three Hostettlers. Now, I have never called it the Hostetler Massacre. I don't intend to start. They are collateral damage caught between two great opposing forces. The British committed as many atrocities as the French did, and they had Native Americans on their side as well. So don't blame the Indians. They're collateral damage. Could they have defended themselves that night? They might have been able to. They chose not to. Jacob and his two sons were taken to Presque Isle on Lake Erie and separated there. And before he left, he told his sons, "Vergesset net Gebet." Don't forget the Lord's Prayer. And Irvin Stutzman has done a masterful job at putting this into story form in a trilogy of books that you should read, called Jacob's Choice, Christian's Hope, and maybe Joseph's Dilemma. Irvin just passed away not long ago. Anyway, in the next spring of 1758, Jacob Sr. Convinced the native family he lived with that he should be allowed to go hunt, and he escaped. And in a harrowing journey, floated down the Susquehanna, was starving to death and found a dead possum. And the dead possum saved his life. But he made it, found some British forces who helped him get back to his home. A few years later, one of his sons, and I always get the sons mixed up, Joseph or Christian, was repatriated in a prisoner exchange. But one of his sons ended up living 8 or 9 years with a Native American family. And in a government act in the 1760s, all white captives among the Native Americans were forced to return to their white families. Now Jacob father came back to this community, remarried, and established a home at his old homestead. And he had the natural right to be very angry at any Native American who he would have ever seen. And by the way, the mantra during this time period was the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Unfortunately, it is a part of our history as Americans that we don't want, United States, well, Americans, that we don't want to look at. But people were very, their lives were not considered on an equivalent level as a white person. 8 or 9 years after that September morning, Jacob, one afternoon, sees a young Native American man come towards him. Can you imagine the fear that Jacob felt? The anger, maybe, that he could have felt? He invites the young native into his home for supper, and the Native American, the young man, declines. Jacob goes into his house and eats his supper. By the way, Irvin Stutzman has done all this research and put it in the form. And after supper, he comes back out, and the young Native American says, "Ons Vader im Himmel," begins to very brokenly recite the Lord's Prayer. And Jacob realizes it's his son. You know, if Jacob would have followed the model of the day, he would have shot that young Indian. His son never joined the Amish church of his parents. He did marry a Dunkard Brethren girl and became a Dunkard Brethren preacher. But never owned land because he was taught by his native family that you cannot own land. You're a part of it. Those are the amazing stories. But we'll return to John and Magdalena. John and Magdalena had 7 more children. They had 11 children, and they all lived to adulthood. And in the 1760s, by the way, we kind of look at cabins and pioneer life as this exciting world. This is much more typical of what a family's cabin might have looked like in Berks County early on. Now, they soon built more substantial houses, but this would be a very typical first home. There is less expectation of privacy. They're small. Many of the boys will sleep in the barn. But John and Magdalena have 11 children, and this is the early land warrants in Somerset County, Berks County, where they live, and they have their place. In the 1760s, late 60s, they begin to hear rumblings of war. The colonies are beginning to say, there's the Boston Tea Party, they're beginning to revolt against the British. They're overlords. And as that is happening, the Amish families, both sides want her boys. Both sides want John and Magdalena's boys. The colonies want them for the colonial army, and the British want them for their army. And John and Magdalena sell their land in Berks County, Pennsylvania, because the war will be fought, and it will soon be, it's already begun, but it will be fought up and down the East Coast. Valley Forge is not far from Berks County at all, where the Amish lived. And so they sell their land, and at the same time, the Penn family has just bought a large piece of land in western Pennsylvania and opens it up for availability. And John and Magdalena make one final move along the Forbes Road, which is, here's a count of 17, the Forbes Road, which is kind of the route of old Route 30, followed that. And before they get to the far west in Pittsburgh, they drop south a little bit into the Brothers Valley. Brutal steel. Along the Maryland border, and John and Magdalena buy a piece of ground they call Miller's Choice. It is 224 acres. I think I'm grateful to David for this work that he's done. with some of this, but they buy 224 acres in around 1785. They had lived there before. That's when they got claim to it. These are their neighbors around them. And the Berks County community dissipates. And some of them move to Lancaster County, but most of them move on west into Somerset County, Pennsylvania, and a little later, Garrett County, Maryland, along the Casselman River. Now, interestingly enough, this area, driving here this morning, I thought about, man, this feels like the Emmental Valley of Switzerland. It feels like the Palatinate and Königsberg. It's this limestone. Do you have limestone-based soil here? Some of it. But we know what to do with this ground. Flatland defeats us. We know what, we're Swiss farmers who know what to do with this kind of ground. And so we settle here. It's here in 1798 that John dies. And Magdalena moves, her oldest grandson moves home to live with Magdalena. In 1798, this fledgling country of the United States of Colonies does its first census. And it records the agriculture census, and it records the widow Miller on 224 acres. And the size of her cabin was 18 by 22. And the size of her barn was 26 by 44. They had their priorities right. But she lived there with her oldest grandson, a man named Yost Miller, and his wife. Yost is a young married man. Now, we happen to have the records of Yost Miller at the High Amish Library. He later moved to Holmes County. Actually, nearly all of her family did, except for Benedict. But think about the oldest grandson moving home and saying, "Grandma, you've had quite the life. What was it like?" And she would have recounted these stories. Born in the Palatinate, that horrific journey, but hope-filled journey to America. And then that first piece of ground in Berks County, Pennsylvania, and she and John getting married. And then that, by the way, the bullet wound crippled John. So they called him Indian John or Crippled John the rest of his life. I was doing this work, and my professor had really encouraged me to dig in and put in a story for him. Try to put yourself into the story. Now, before my wife and I had moved to Yale, I'd went to see my grandmother. At that point, she was a 90-year-old Amish woman who had lived all her life on the same farm. That farm I showed you at the beginning. She now lived in the Doughty house. I once took one of my Ohio State professors. He told me he wanted to see a real Amish person. I'll take you to see a real Amish person. Let Grandma know we're coming. And met him that morning, and he drove a blue Miata convertible. And he said, "Do you want to drive or should I drive?" I said, "You drive." I want to drive in the Miata convertible. So we're driving. I'm waving to everybody in Holmes County in the convertible. We drove in, my grandma, the long lane going up. And when you got to my grandmother's house, you walked around the back, and she would sit in the living room, and you simply knocked on the door, then you opened it and said, "Grandma, Mommy." And she said, "Oh, it's you, Marcus." She always knew who it was. She had 74 grandchildren, 12 children, 74 grandchildren. I'm the oldest grandchild, and we always go by order of age, so I get good dessert. Anyway, the others get the leftover. Anyway, so I took my professor in, and she came alive. And she said, "Oh, I'll put some coffee on." She had one of those Lifetime coffee pots, and she put the water in. So pretty soon you could hear boop, 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 and the smell invaded. And he asked her, "So what were you doing?" And she said, "Oh, I was just sitting here reading the budget." And then I had to explain to him what the budget was. That it's not a financial set of financial values. It is a newspaper that the Amish put together. And he was really intrigued. He said, oh, so you know, oh, yeah. She said, my cousin lives in so-and-so. I was reading about him. And he asked her, have you lived here all your life? And she said, yeah, I moved up to the other end of the farm for a few years, but I came back. This is the home place. And I realized that she was born in that farmhouse. And she had gone to the same church all her 90 years. And because they sit by age, I asked her, when did you start sitting with the girls? She said, when I was 10 years old. She had sat beside the same woman in church for 80 years. And they didn't always like each other very well. They're humans. And when we had our coffee and we left, as we were going out the driveway, my professor, who was not an effusive man, reached over and punched me on the shoulder and said, you set me up. I set you up? What do you mean? He said, no one lives like that. No one has that good of life. Now, I happen to know my grandma had some really, really hard things in her life. But to the world looking in, that sense of community and continuity is something they don't have. So I was really close to my grandmother. Before we left for Yale, I went to see her. I said, Grandma, I'm going to go to graduate school. And she said, now why would you want to do that? So I explained to her, and she said, oh, okay. She kind of got it. By the way, when I graduated with my undergraduate degree, I invited her to my graduation party. And she came. She drove 55 miles in the backseat of my dad's car and came. And she gave me a card that said, congratulations, I'm proud of you, and best wishes. And had a $20 bill in it. I have not yet spent that $20 bill. Anyway, I'm in the middle of writing this project. My father calls me. And he said, Grandma's not well. I told you a story about my father, which happened at the end of our time at Yale. This is in the first semester at Yale. When I went to see Grandma, I think she and I both realized that we may not see each other again. And I was working on this project, and I said, well, keep me posted. And sure enough, a day and a half later, 2 a.m. in the morning, my phone rang. And it was my father saying, Grandma's died. And we packed up our car the next morning and drove that long journey through New York City back. And by that evening, we're sitting in this steaming Amish shop. She died in the room she was born in, surrounded by her 12 children and their spouses. And I sit right next to the youngest son, and people are going through and shaking hands, and an older man from the community whose mother, he's my father's age, but we've always been friends, whose mother is the same age as my grandma, came through, and I said, how's your mother? And he said, oh, she's good. She could mow her own yard yet, but we don't let her. I said, well, can I stop in? And he said, but you can't visit with her. I said, can't visit with her. And I discovered she had dementia. And the historian brain in me began to process, and I began to think about what happens when a person loses their memory. When a person loses their memory, they have no ability to relate in the modern world, in the world that they live in, because they have no basis. When a group of people loses their collective memory, we don't have much ground to be relevant in our world. Magdalena and Yost moved in with her, the oldest grandson. And a few years after that, in the early 1800s, her oldest son, Jacob, came to her and said, Grandma, we're thinking about moving to this strange place on west of here. There's new land available. It's called the Ohio. You know what Grandma said? Now, why would you want to do that? That's just what Grandma say. And Jacob may have reminded her, but think about you and Grandpa's journey. if you wouldn't have taken the risks you did. And so Jacob and his 2 sons, wife and 2 sons, and their 21-year-old nephew, in the May of 1809, move on west to the Sugar Creek and the Walnut Creek from here. Took them 6 weeks to travel from here to what is now Holmes County in a wagon, Conestoga wagon, pulled by 6 horses. I laid out the harnesses. It would have been the length of a modern-day semi, creaking through the woods. Yost wanted to move, our oldest grandson wanted to move to Ohio too, but he was a bit of a academic, intellectual, so he took care of the law work for the community. And he kept those papers. He settled his grandfather's estate, and then his father, John Jr., died as well, so he settled that estate. And it wasn't until the summer of 1815 that Yost moved on west to Ohio. And it was late in the spring of 1816 when the Miller family in Ohio would have gotten word, already 4 weeks old by then, that Grandma died. Magdalena died in 1816. She's buried very near here. Ask David, will help you point it in the right direction. But their family has had more impact on probably this community and the Amish community in Ohio than any other family, and more descendants sprinkled throughout the system. And so they're an apt family for us to study. Their journey, I don't intend to glorify them or their journey, but I intend to tell, I need to tell you these stories. By the way, here again is a cabin. This would have been a typical house, or maybe a second house that they would have built. That would have, houses were a necessary means to get by, they weren't fancy. Here they move on west to Ohio. Here's a picture of that same house. They lived in places like this. The sense of home place. All of us are looking for a place to settle. And physically, for our people, it's Berks County and then the Casselman. And then on west into other places. But we often return to our homes. And in a spiritual sense, I think this is a call to those of us who are Anabaptists today to return to a sense of being deeply connected to our faith, being deeply connected to our families, and being deeply connected to our communities. I often think about the words of that professor from Ohio State. By the way, I should tell you this. When my grandmother died, she died at 2:30 in the morning. At 5:30, the neighbors began to show up. These are people she's lived around all her life. They haven't always liked each other. And they start doing the chores. For the next 3 days, the family doesn't do any work. They sit and grieve. They're taken care of. Those are the living traditions I was talking about the first night. One of the first people to come at daylight was an old lady, the woman who sat beside my grandmother for 80 years. And she had a Tupperware dish of green Jell-O. And I have often thought green Jell-O has never tasted the same since, because it tastes salty like the tears, but it tastes deep like the sense of community. And my professor at both Ohio State and then one at Yale helped me understand that this deep sense of connectedness to spaces, ecological spaces, like the Casselman, like my home place, that's a picture of it, help us find our place in the modern world. And the stories of history are intended to bring us to a place where we can actually think about, where do I fit in today's world? I think the gifts that people like John and Magdalena, my grandmother, and our Amish and Mennonite families who precede us have given us is we are deeply committed to our faith. Now, for many of us,
talking about our faith is less important than living it well. And in a world where talk is cheap, a lived faith speaks louder than words. They also gave us a gift of family, a deep commitment to family. I tell people that we live in a bubble where there are more intact family units than any other place in the United States. Now, some of those family units don't work and need a lot of help. But children, if we believe the statistics that we hear, over 50% of the children in the United States will grow up in a home where the mother and father are not the blood mother and father, either single or divided homes. And again, I'm not saying that there isn't cause for dividing families. Yes, there is. Abuse and those kind of things. But they have also given us a gift of fighting for that space where family is of utmost importance. You know, people in Holmes County don't care very much about my 2 degrees that I paid big money for and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. They want to know, now who was your grandpa? I was at Monroe's, Milo's, Leroy's, Oh, yeah, you're my first cousin once removed on my mother's side. And my wife, whose father was from Kelowna, Iowa, and her mother was from Wayne County, will elbow me and say, so is the other half of Holmes County. We're all related, but it means something. It's because we have this commitment to family. And then we have a deep commitment to community. And John and Magdalena didn't move in a vacuum, both to Berks County or to Somerset County. They moved in community, and they built community wherever they went. And we cannot lose that sense of community and connectedness, because when we do, we become statistics. Now, all of those carry some negatives. There is less expectation of privacy in our communities because we watch out for each other. We had lived in New Haven, Connecticut. By the way, when we moved there, the first night we settled into our apartment, I looked at Narita and said, do you feel what I feel? Yeah? Let's leave. I took a map and looked at the person. Where is somebody who knows who I know? And I realized that the closest person to me was in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Actually, I knew a few people in New York City, but that seemed way too daunting. It was good for us. Showed us what a gift community is. But we moved back to Holmes County right after Yale, and what a culture shock. And my father, like I told you early in this time, my father died. And at the end, so my mother was reliant on me that first summer to make sure a lot of things happened. And late in the summer, I was supposed to go to her house one night, and I called her and said, Mom, I can't come, I've got a church meeting. And she was disappointed. And the next day, early in the next morning, she called me and she said, you weren't at the church meeting. Yes, I was, Mom. She said, no, you were not. And I'm still a little boy there. And I said, Mom, I was too. And she said, no, you weren't. Someone saw your truck at the drive-thru. And I thought she meant Burger King. I said, I don't go to Burger King. She said, no, the drive-thru where you buy beer and wine. Mom, I was not at the drive-thru. And she said, yes, Aunt Sarah's friend saw your truck there and called Aunt Sarah, then Aunt Sarah called me. Ooh, it's a little tight. But when you stop and think about it, there are also some natural safety that is built into that sense of community. And we as Anabaptists have believed very strongly that we're called to look out for each other. And so that means our lives are more open to each other than many people's lives are. God bless you. We've got them to the Casselman and beyond, right? The limitations of doing this in 4 sessions is I generally teach this in 16 weeks, twice a week.
but we gave it an overview.
Yeah, that was special, and tying some of your own personal stories in with that was really inspiring, and I enjoyed that very much. Don't know even how to put that into words. I do have one question before I open it up to you all, and my question is, how much of the dangers, the probabilities of people dying on the crossing to America do you think was known to the communities where they were coming from? Did they know what they were getting themselves into, and the desire was still that strong, or did it come as a rude shock to them?
They knew the risk. But also, don't forget, they live in a world that is, the life expectancy is lower. But they knew the risk, especially later. There's only, like we historians argue about minutiae like this, but it's thought that at the most, 300 or maybe 400 people total came that make up all of Lancaster County, this area, Holmes County, northern Indiana. So the immigrant pool is small. The genetic pool is small. That's our family trees don't look like trees, they look like diamonds, because we go back to a few families. For instance, in 8 generations, I'm 18 times Hostetler, Jacob Hostetler, and 14 times John Miller, and 13 times the widow Yoder, who are the immigrants. But they knew the risk. But they also knew that there was not much life left for them there. The Amish church in Europe kept kind of going and dwindling, and in the 1930s, they merged with the Mennonite church in Europe. So there are no Amish there.
Okay, I don't know that I realized just exactly how small that group was that came over here. Thank you. All right, from the audience, any observations or comments from your side, questions, your own personal family histories that maybe relate? Yes, if you could just wait till they bring the mic for you.
Enjoyed it again very much. I think people might enjoy knowing that there were also good Amish and Indian relationships. And you might enjoy taking a peek at the picture back here on the table and reading the story that goes along with it. So the Amish believed that instead of chasing the Indians off of their land or killing them, you can practice Christian hospitality. And you might take a peep at that. And it's interesting, these people were also my ancestors, the Hostetlers and the Millers. They have a question. Can you explain how you were at the drive-thru and not at the drive-thru?
I was not at the drive-thru. I drove a copper-colored Chevy Avalanche, and there are 3 of them in Holmes County, I discovered. And I was at the church meeting. I finally convinced I offered my mom that she could call my fellow pastors to make sure I was at the church meeting, and then she understood. It's just one of the examples of how there are less expectations of privacy. Also known as nosiness sometimes.
Okay, anybody? Yes.
Observation yet about what you said. Generally, the Amish were careful to settle on land that was not contested. So in, for instance, Holmes County, they didn't settle north of the Greenville Treaty Line until long after that land opened, because that land had been set aside for native use. And so they were careful not to do that. They wanted to settle on land, partially because of their view of land ownership, but also partially because they believed, at least to some level, in the dignity of every human life. See, one of the things that strikes me about non-resistance, love and non-resistance, whatever term we want to use there, is that it allows us to think about the dignity of every human life, not just those who are like us. And the Amish firmly believe that. And so they went to lengths to mend relationships with the people around them, including Native Americans. Yeah.
Marcus, you explained how things were in Europe in 1737.
Yeah.
How was it 100 years later when my Orndorff's ancestors came over?
It's better. There is better engineering for the ships. They tend to be less crowded. But it's still risky, very risky. And did they come through New York or Philadelphia? Do you know? A few more of, most of the 98%, 99% of the Amish and early Mennonites would have come through Philadelphia, partially because Pennsylvania offered them land. So a few of the later ones came through Ellis Island in New York City, the famous Ellis Island, but most of them came through Philadelphia. By the way, before the Revolutionary War and even after, you had to give your name, at least your last name, to the immigration agent when you disembarked from the ship. And these are German farmers, some of them uneducated, who don't know how to speak English. And so it's really fascinating to read the ship's lists. For instance, Yoder is spelled Y-O-D-R, J-O-D-E-R, Y-E-T-T-E-R, Yato. You can imagine these German farmers there. Last name, was will er? If you want your last name, ich bin Johannes Yettel. And the immigration agent simply wrote down what he heard. I know that about the Yoders and others. But by 1830s, it's a little different once they come to America, because the colonies are the leading thing rather than the British. And the British had offered, there is more space to operate within the colonies than there was for the earlier settlers, who tended to remain very tightly in Pennsylvania.
That was one thing I was going to ask about, is the length of that journey for Magdalena and her family. Seems unusually long.
It is.
Do we have any indication of what caused that length?
Storms and then no wind. And it blew them off course. They nearly ran out of water. By the way, there are accounts of ships running out of water, and the people ended up drinking olive oil, casks of olive oil. It's the only way to survive. It was risky. It was an extra long journey. The average journey is 6 to 7 weeks, and this is near 12 weeks. So it's storms and no wind.
And I remember reading about, this is water that's kept in wooden casks. It was not, sterilized or anything else like that before it went in there, and it's alive and growing by the time you are drinking it.
And food's the same way. Think about eating a 12-week-old Swiss cheese and biscuits. A natural antibiotic called mold.
All right. Thank you. Over here, just wait to, oh, you have it already. Wonderful.
I've got it. I come as a guest from outside of the community, and also a young guest at that. And I was particularly struck by your phrase of how our connection to our ecology helps guide us in the modern world. And so I guess my question is a broader question to people like myself, younger people. What in your work, and specifically this project, have you found that could be important in translating to where we are today?
Yeah. They would be appalled. I'm careful how I say this. They thought creation care, let's put it like that, taking care of the land that you are privileged to own, was an important factor. They would have not understood terms of modern environmental movement at all, but they believe very strongly that they're stewards of the land that God ultimately owns, but they're given stewardship of. And so this connection to ecological space meant that they actually cared for that space in a way that was different than many of the people around them. They would be appalled at the politicization of the environmental movement, but they would have very strongly believed that you should take care of the land very carefully. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. And also ecology in the sense of your home. In kind of a time where a lot of people, say, from outside of the counties of the Mennonite and the Amish community are very far and flung between, you know, as you related with the modern family.
I think one of the things that we offer as Anabaptists in our world, I think this is our generation. Because I think younger people are anxiously looking for places to connect, for home places, because it's been largely absent in many of their lives. And I think the people of Jesus have a chance to offer that, maybe not in a physical property, but in a place of belonging that is even deeper than the physical home place. It's a place of belonging. And I think that we as the followers of Jesus, have an opportunity to offer that. There is a lot of unrootedness. Is that a word? Yeah, in our world today. And people are looking for places to root to connect to. And I think that our churches should be places that are safe for people to come to find that family and connection and community. I think community in our world today translates not into the physical properties of our spaces, but into the spiritual realities of the people of God caring for each other. It may be physical properties, but it is the people of God caring for each other. But I am quite passionate that we are called to be stewards, and so if you want to call me an environmentalist, I am that. I'm with my friend David Klein when he says, Amish bishop and author, by the way, who knows Oprah Winfrey personally. David says, God, through his providence, gave us this piece of ground. It is my job to reflect his glory through how I operate on this piece of ground. And that is a strong call to care for, to steward the resources God has given us. Good questions. Very good.
All right. We do have a Q or an open mic session scheduled for after lunch. And if you're not going to be here after lunch, I will allow like one more question. If there's somebody you know you're not going to be here, you really, really want to ask Marcus this question. But otherwise, we'll save anything more for after lunch. So anybody you know you're not going to be here, but you really want to ask Marcus a question. All right. And so I want to say about that we will plan to have that open mic session down in the basement after lunch. So following lunch, you can just, remain in conversation with your friends and so on. And when it seems like it's an appropriate time, we will call that to order, and you can ask Marcus questions that came up in a discussion maybe with the people sitting at your tables and so on, but there will be more opportunity to interact with Marcus then. I'd like to have an offering lifted at this time for the expenses of the meeting. Bernard, are you able to take care of that? Okay. So yeah, you can go ahead and come on forward. And these donations that you give are for the expenses of the meeting itself. And you can go ahead and lift that. Thank you. And then for the meal, there will be a place at the start of the table where the food is. That'll be served cafeteria style, and there'll be a basket there where you can place your donation for the meal if you wish to stay for the meal. A reminder again that Marcus has a book back there on the table, if you're interested in it, that covers some of these themes that he touched on today and last evening. Also, recordings of the sessions are available back there on the table for $3 per session on CD if you want that. Am I forgetting anything that should be taken care of? Okay. And I'm not sure exactly when the meal will be ready, but I would like to have us stand and ask the Lord's blessing on this series of meetings and on the food, and then I'll try and let you know when the meal is ready to be served. Yes.
So Alice and I will not be here this afternoon, so we'll be closing down this part.
Okay. All right. So if you want, are the CDs still going to be there, or should they get those CDs before they go to lunch if they are interested in those?
Probably should get them before.
Okay, so anything that you need as far as recordings, or if you want to renew a membership or anything like that with Bernard and Alice back there, take care of that before you go down for lunch. Thank you. All right, would you stand, please? Father in heaven, thank you so much for the opportunity that we had to be here to listen to the topics that Marcus presented. Bless him for the time and effort that he put into preparing for them, for taking time out of his schedule to come here and be here and share them with us. Would you bless what we've learned to our hearts, to our minds? Might it renew our passion for you and our passion for living well with each other. Bless the food that has been prepared to our bodies and our time of fellowship with each other. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. I should have reminded you again that tonight and tomorrow night there will be the performance of the drama, Not Regina, at the Bittinger Church. And do you still have that phone number to contact? It's a drama set in this time period, or the time period of the beginning of the Anabaptists. And could you just say what that phone number is again?
301-501-0793.
All right. So if you want to attend that drama, You don't need, it's open to the public. You don't need to buy a ticket, but you do need to confirm that there is still space. And the phone number to contact for that is 301-501-0793 to make sure that there's still room for you to attend if you're going. Thank you so much. Feel free to visit and so on, and I will try and let you know as soon as I find out that the meal is ready to be served. Thank you.